Welcome to the second screencast, looking at the mock exam for Year 1 A-Level Sociology. Now in the previous video we focused on section 1 of the mock exam, and in this particular video we're going to turn our attention to section 2 of the mock, which covers the component 2 work that we've been doing this year so far on research methods. And you will have 50 minutes in total to spend on this section of the mock. And to be fully prepared for these questions, you need to revise everything that we've done on research methods so far, up to and including the work on sampling techniques. So it would obviously be a very good idea to re-watch all of these screencasts that you can see on the screen at the moment, and really make sure that your Cornell notes are as good and as detailed as they possibly can be. It's also essential for the methods question to have examples of real pieces of research. So in addition to the screencast that you saw on the previous slide, make sure that you've watched and made notes on this video, which gives you lots of examples of studies that you can use when you're discussing experiments, observational methods and questionnaires. And then you'll need to watch the first 7 minutes of this particular video, Key Studies to Use in the Exam Part 2, and that first 7 minutes of this screencast will cover examples that you can use if you were to get a question about interviews or sampling techniques. What you can see on the screen at the moment is the layout that's going to be used for the method section of the mock exam, although the questions will be different to this. And this particular part of the mock exam is based on the first half of the real component 2 exam that you'll do at the end of the second year. And you can see that there's an item that you need to read, so that will be a short piece of text describing a piece of sociological research, and then underneath the item we can see 3 questions. So there are 2 5-mark questions and then a 20-mark question. Now the first 5-mark question on the research methods section is going to ask you to explain what is meant by a key term from research methods. So we can see in this particular example that you're being asked to explain what is meant by the positivist approach to research. So the key term that needs to be explained in this question is positivism. And you need to explain what is meant by the key term using both material from the item as well as your own sociological knowledge. And for this question you get 3 marks for your own knowledge and understanding of the key term, and then 2 marks for application. An application in this question is based on your ability to interpret and then apply material from the item to the question set. So to get all of the marks for this question, you need to define the key term precisely in your first sentence. And this is where it's so important to make sure that you've learned by heart clear and precise definitions of all of the key terms from this particular unit. And this is where I think the use of Memrise is really important in helping you to learn the key terms. Remember, as I've said over and over again, the key to using Memrise effectively is to use it regularly. Little but often is the way in which you use this tool to help you remember things in the long term. Remember to try to use an example of your own to show understanding of the key term in the question, and also to refer to the item. So remember, application in this question is about your ability to use material from the item to help you explain the key term in the question. And then in terms of length and time management, we should only be looking at 1 paragraph. This is not a long answer. 3 or 4 sentences is probably enough, and you should aim to spend about 7 to 8 minutes of the mock exam time on this question. What I suggest that you do now is hit the pause button, read through this question carefully. Remember, this is the question that's asking you to explain what is meant by the positivist approach to research, read through the item carefully, and then have a go at writing a paragraph that answers this particular question. So hit the pause button and have a go at answering the question that you can see on the screen. And if we compare what you've written to the answer that is appearing on the screen now, if you just read through this model answer would get 5 marks out of 5. So in the first sentence, we've got a clear and precise definition of positivism. So that term is clearly defined in the first sentence. And then after that, we've got use of the item as instructed to do so in the question. And also in the final sentence, this candidate brings in an example of their own, drawing upon Durkheim's famous study of suicide. So positivism is clearly defined, and understanding of that key term is clearly demonstrated through the use of an example from both the item and also an example from the candidate's own knowledge. Now the second 5-mark question is really closely linked to the item that they give you. And it will ask you to explain why the researcher or researchers described in the item, why they decided to use or wanted to use a particular method. So in the example that you can see on the screen, the second 5-mark question is asking you to explain why the researcher may have wanted to use in-depth interviews in her research. And in-depth interviews would be qualitative interviews, so that would be either an unstructured or a semi-structured approach to interviewing. For this question, you get 2 marks for your knowledge of the method, but you get 3 marks for your ability to relate your knowledge of the method to the item. And as we shall see in a moment when we look at a couple of examples, relating your knowledge of the method to the item is crucial for this section of the exam. So to get maximum marks on this section of the exam, you need to read the item carefully, and you need to make sure that the reason that you give in your answer is explicitly related to the example given in the item. So it's not enough to give a generic reason for the use of a particular method. The reason that you give has to relate very explicitly to the piece of research described in the item. Secondly, make sure that you develop the explanation part of your answer clearly and use specialist terminology wherever possible. So when you're thinking about why a sociologist chose a particular method, think in terms of things like practicality, ethics, representativeness, reliability and validity. And then finally, once again in terms of time management and length of answer, we should be looking at a paragraph of about 3 or 4 sentences, and therefore 7 or 8 minutes should be enough time to spend on this section of the mock. Okay, like we did with the previous question, my suggestion now is to hit the pause button, read through this question carefully, read through the item, because what you write has to be related to this particular study, and then give yourself a few minutes to write a paragraph answering this particular question. And now compare what you've written to the example that you can see on the screen at the bottom. Just have a read through this sample answer. See what you make of it. How many marks do you think this particular answer would get? Now, it would actually only get 2 marks out of 5. And the reason for that is that though there is relevant knowledge of the method in this paragraph, it hasn't been related at all to the piece of research described in the item. In other words, this candidate would get 2 marks for knowledge, but 0 marks out of 3 for application. Now hit the pause button and compare the previous answer to this answer to the same question, and you should see a big difference. So this answer would get 5 marks out of 5, and the reason for this is, once again, there is relevant and accurate knowledge of semi-structured interviews, but unlike the previous answer, it's really closely related to the study that's described in the item, and that's what you've got to do in order to get maximum marks on this section of the exam. The final section of the mock exam will be a 20-mark question on research methods, and typically these questions will ask you to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of a particular method or research design. Now, to get as many marks as possible for the 20 marker, you need to begin with a clear definition of the method and state whether or not it produces primary or secondary data, whether or not it produces quantitative or qualitative data, and whether or not we would associate it with either a positivist or an interpretivist approach to research. So about a paragraph explaining the method in the opening section of your mini essay question. Then you need to make around about 4 to 5 evaluation points. So if the question is asking you to look at the strengths and weaknesses of a method, you would need to identify and then explain at least 2 strengths and at least 2 weaknesses of the method, but obviously more if you have the time to do so. And when you're evaluating the method, think about practicality, ethics, reliability, representativeness and validity. And here's a very easy way to remember these evaluation issues. Make sure that your answer includes at least 2 studies that you've learned to illustrate the evaluative points that you're going to make. So make sure you watch the screencasts where I go through a whole range of studies that you can use for all the main methods. Make sure that you refer to the item. Again, you will get marks for applying material from the item in a way which is relevant to the question. And this is the longest section of the mock exam. So this is a mini essay question, and you should aim to spend 35 minutes on this section of the mock. So putting all of that advice together, here is a suggested way of structuring your answer for the 20-mark question. And what you can see on the screen at the moment is an example of an opening paragraph to a 20-mark question about participant observation. So this is an example of how you would go about defining the method in the question in the opening section of your answer. And remember, one of the things to flag up here is whether or not the method would be associated with a positivist or an interpretivist approach to research. So if we're focusing on a quantitative research method, in other words, if the research method is trying to reliably measure things, then we would call that method an example of a positivist approach. If, on the other hand, like participant observation, the research method focuses on looking for the meanings behind social actions, and the emphasis is on understanding the world from the subject's point of view, what we call Verstehen, then it's going to be a qualitative approach which we would associate with interpretivism. Let's move on to the main body of your answer and look at how you set out paragraphs in this section of your answer. And I recommend the following advice for your paragraph structure in the main section of your answer. Your first sentence should identify the point that you're going to make. That point then needs to be explained in more detail to demonstrate to the examiner that you really understand it. You then need to try to use an example. That could be an example from either the item or an example from your own sociological knowledge, and you need to make sure that the point that you make is linked explicitly to the question. So let's imagine that you're writing a paragraph describing one of the disadvantages of using participant observation. So you might start with a sentence like this that flags up or identifies the point that you're going to make in the paragraph about the practical problems of using this method. Then you need to add to that by explaining the practical difficulties that participant observers often face. So here we've got an additional sentence saying that one of the really practical problems with participant observation is trying to immerse yourself in the group being observed. Then you need to try to link that point to a relevant example, and in this paragraph we've got the use of John Howard Griffin's study as an example of the practical difficulties of immersing yourself in a group. And then it can be useful to end your paragraph with a sentence that links your example back to the point of the paragraph and the essay title. So putting all of that together, we can see how this paragraph is constructed as a whole. So there's the point, there's the explanation, there's the example, and there's a linking sentence that relates the point back to the question. And the question that this candidate was attempting was about the disadvantages of using participant observation. Here's another paragraph from a different candidate, but on the same question about the problems or disadvantages of using participant observation, and once again we can see it constructed using this peel approach. And here's one further example for the same question. And here's another example of the peel paragraph, but this one is answering a different question about the advantages and disadvantages of using questionnaires, but you can see that the paragraph is constructed in the same way as the ones that we saw previously in relation to participant observation. And you should round off your 20-mark question with a concluding paragraph, and in the concluding paragraph don't say something really obvious and bland like this method has both advantages and disadvantages. Instead, think about which types of research are best and least suited to the method or research design stated in the question. For example, if you hit the pause button and read through this paragraph, this is an effective conclusion to a 20-mark question about the advantages and disadvantages of using unstructured interviews.